A racist and corrupt police officer arrests the wrong black woman in court without knowing she's an undercover FBI agent, and what she does to him afterward leaves the entire room in stunned silence. The courtroom had already gone quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. All eyes turned toward the back, where a tall, uniformed officer moved through the benches like a hunter. His eyes locked on her, calm, composed, in a navy blue suit, not a hair out of place. She had just stood up moments ago, interrupting his rough treatment of a young black defendant. She had spoken clearly, confidently, asking him to respect basic rights, to stop barking orders like a prison guard. That was all it took. The courtroom didn't erupt. It just froze. He turned to her and asked, with venom tucked behind his smirk, "Who the hell do you think you are?" She didn't flinch. She spoke with the ease of someone who was used to being heard, but not here, not today. "Someone who knows the law," she said. The smirk twisted. He took a step closer, and before anyone could react, the cuffs were out. "You wanna play smart? Let's see how smart you sound in jail," he snapped. There was no resistance. No yelling. She simply extended her wrists with slow, deliberate grace. But in her eyes, behind the calm, there was something brewing. Something dangerous. Something no one in that courtroom saw coming. People gasped. Others looked away. No one helped. The judge didn't object. The clerk paused, then went back to typing. To them, it was just another moment. Just another black woman, talking back, getting put in her place. And as she was walked past the defendant's bench, the same young man she tried to protect looked at her with wide, helpless eyes. The officer shoved her slightly at the door. "Bet you'll think twice before opening your mouth next time," he whispered. "Bet you will too," she replied, just as low, just as steady. What they didn't know, what not a single soul in that room imagined, was that she had planned every second of this. Every single piece of that humiliating scene was bait. The courtroom, the officer, the public display, the silence of the judge, it was all part of a carefully constructed trap. And the man who thought he was asserting dominance had just walked into it head first. Because she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't some random woman playing lawyer, or some activist with a badge-shaped keychain. No. She was federal. Higher than anyone in that room. And she'd spent the last 8 months building a case so airtight it would suffocate the very department that allowed this kind of rot to spread in plain sight. But to understand how all of this unfolded, you have to rewind just 10 minutes before the arrest. She had arrived at the courthouse early, silent, blending into the crowd. She had one job that day: observe and collect final behavioral data on Officer Samuel Royce, the man at the center of over a dozen brutality and discrimination complaints, all of them conveniently dismissed or buried under procedural rubble. She had her credentials tucked in her inner pocket, her mic embedded in a custom pin on her lapel, and her hidden camera blinking softly from behind a pair of smart lenses. She'd been watching him from the start of the session, how he scanned the room, how he spoke to defendants who looked like her, how he barked at clerks but smiled at attorneys. And then, it happened. He grabbed the wrist of the teen boy being led out of the holding area, twisted it unnecessarily, and leaned in to whisper something none of the microphones could pick up. But she saw the flinch. The shame. That was the moment she spoke. And that was the moment he took the bait. But no one knew. Not the bailiff. Not the judge. Not the public defenders who kept their heads down. Not the security camera that had mysteriously been turned slightly to the left that morning. She let him put her in cuffs. She let him drag her down the corridor. She let the entire court think they were watching another black woman silenced, humiliated, and erased. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that as he pushed open the door to the holding area, 3 agents were already on their way. That inside her jacket, a hidden wire was capturing every word. That she had activated a sequence the second the cuffs touched her skin. And that he was seconds away from being the defendant in a federal court case that would ruin him, his career, and expose a network of officers just like him. But none of that was visible in that moment. What the people saw was a woman arrested. A black woman, cuffed. A warning. That's how the system worked. That's how it kept working. Until someone walked straight into the fire, calm and fully aware, and flipped the entire game on its head. What made her do it? Why would someone willingly step into humiliation, into the jaws of a broken system, just to prove a point? Because she knew something no one else did. She knew the only way to expose someone who hides behind the law is to let them believe, even for a moment, that the law doesn't apply to them. She gave him that moment. She made it real. And then she took it away. But the true shock didn't come when she revealed her badge. It didn't come when she walked back into that courtroom, uncuffed and standing beside a federal marshal. It didn't come when she read out the indictment or when the cameras rolled back the footage in front of the public. The true shock came after. After the courtroom emptied. After the headlines ran. After the applause. Because what she did next, what she whispered to the officer as he was taken away, is something only two people know. Her, and him. And you're going to want to hear what it was. Are you ready to find out what really happened next? Because this is the story of a woman who was arrested for defending a child, and ended up arresting the entire system in return. To every black viewer watching this right now, we see you, we respect you, and we stand with you. At Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. Our stories aim to reflect truth, emotion, and justice, because your voice and your experience matter. Enjoy today's story. It's one of karma, power, and redemption. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Now, get ready. The courthouse in Augusta, Georgia, had the kind of architecture that whispered authority before you even walked in. Tall columns, old brick, polished marble floors, it was built to impress, to remind you who held the power. But for Keisha Monroe, it was just another structure hiding the same rut she had spent most of her life trying to uproot. On the surface, she was just another face in the crowd that morning, a calm, composed black woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a tailored navy suit, heels that clicked softly on the marble, and eyes that carried the kind of focus that comes from knowing how easily things could go wrong. To everyone around her, she looked like someone's lawyer, maybe a paralegal, perhaps a junior associate with too much on her plate. No one guessed who she really was. And that's exactly how she needed it. Keisha had grown up in Savannah, just 3 hours east of Augusta, where the Spanish moss dripped off the trees and racism was thick in the air, polite and poisonous. Her father, a mechanic, had taught her how to break down engines and read silence like a map. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had taught her how to speak so that people listened, but also how to survive when they didn't. She had always been the quiet one, the girl who watched more than she spoke, who never argued unless it mattered. That patience had taken her far, farther than most people expected. After college in Atlanta and a quick, ruthless rise through the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division, she'd been recruited into the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where her specialty became one thing: identifying patterns of abuse within law enforcement structures. Not just rogue officers, but entire systems that protected them. She didn't wear that on her sleeve. You wouldn't find her name in articles or see her face on press conferences. Her work wasn't the kind that needed applause, it required shadows, silence, and strategy. For nearly a year, she had been tracking complaints that centered around the Augusta Police Department, particularly one officer, Samuel Royce. A white man in his 40s, with 15 years on the force and a flawless public record. But scratch beneath the surface and you found dust, formal complaints from black and brown defendants dismissed before review, videos lost, witnesses recanted after pressure, and always a thread of unspoken power keeping everything in place. Keisha knew his type. They operated like chess players, always 3 moves ahead, always with just enough deniability to stay out of reach. Until someone like her got close enough. Samuel was known in the department as one of the good ones, firm, no nonsense, but fair. That word, fair, got thrown around a lot by people who didn't live with the consequences of his decisions. In reality, he was a ticking time bomb of unchecked aggression and arrogance, hiding behind a polished badge. He wore his uniform like armor, and his authority like a weapon. Keisha had studied hours of footage, courtrooms, street stops, holding rooms. He had a pattern: he pushed hardest when he felt challenged, and he hated being corrected. It wasn't about justice for him. It was about control. On that Tuesday morning, court was in session early. The air was tense with paperwork, the rustling of legal pads, and the faint squeak of shoes against tile. Keisha sat quietly in the back, phone off, posture relaxed but alert. She watched as people filtered in, nervous defendants, overworked public defenders, a few family members holding hope in their eyes. Then Samuel walked in. He had a swagger that wasn't arrogance, it was entitlement. The courtroom shifted when he entered, like it always did. People sat straighter. Some avoided eye contact. Others rolled their eyes discreetly. His presence brought a weight that wasn't visible but deeply felt. Keisha had seen him speak to the court clerk without saying, "Please," brush past the security guard without a glance, snap at a young Latina girl in the hallway for loitering. All before 9 a.m. And then, the first hearing began. A black teenager, 16, maybe 17, was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit far too big for him. He looked scared but quiet, avoiding everyone's eyes. His name was Darnell, and he'd been picked up for trespassing behind a grocery store that had recently been vandalized. No video, no evidence, just a description: black male, hoodie. Keisha had reviewed his file the night before. Samuel was assigned to escort him from holding into the courtroom. And in front of everyone, he grabbed the boy's arm tighter than necessary, whispered something low enough that the judge didn't hear, but the boy clearly did, his expression twisted with humiliation. That was when Keisha stood up, slow and deliberate, her voice cutting through the hush. "Excuse me, officer. That's unnecessary force." The courtroom fell into that strange, hushed tension that comes when someone breaks the script. Samuel turned slowly, as if daring her to continue. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, assessing, measuring, underestimating. His jaw flexed. He stepped forward. "And who exactly are you?" She held his stare. "Someone who understands basic human rights." That was it. That was all it took. His hand reached for the cuffs at his belt, already set on domination. His voice dropped just enough to sound menacing without technically threatening. "You wanna interrupt court proceedings? Try that in holding." He walked toward her, already pulling the cuffs out. The judge didn't stop him. No one moved. The room had learned to keep still when men like Samuel got that look in their eyes. And Keisha, she let it happen. She extended her wrists without a word. Her expression didn't change. She walked calmly beside him as murmurs rose from the benches, as a public defender looked up and then looked away. The humiliation was visible, almost cinematic. The imagery of a black woman in a suit, being cuffed and walked out of a courtroom by a white officer with a record of racially charged complaints. To the spectators, it was one more example of what happens when you speak too loud, stand too tall, or dare to challenge authority. And yet, what they didn't know was that this moment, the silence, the stares, the indignity, was part of something much, much bigger. Back in the hallway, as Samuel pressed her against the wall to secure the cuffs tighter, Keisha didn't blink. He leaned close, voice dripping with disdain. "You think because you read a few law books, you can talk to me like that?" She tilted her head slightly. "I think we'll both be surprised by what I know." He laughed, a dry scoff, before yanking her by the elbow toward the holding area. The entire walk, she kept her eyes forward, not missing the way people stared, a mixture of confusion and fear. Even the courthouse security looked unsure. But no one said a word. Because this was how it always happened. A sudden decision, a false charge, and a black body in handcuffs. The system moved fast when it wanted to crush. Keisha had prepared for this. Not just mentally, but emotionally. She knew it would sting. She knew it would feel like every indignity her parents warned her about, every moment she'd watched her friends go through while growing up. And still, she chose this. She had studied Samuel for months, but today she wasn't studying anymore. Today was the execution of a plan so meticulously built that even a single misstep could have unraveled the entire thing. But Keisha didn't make missteps. She didn't play fast or loud. She moved quietly, precisely. Like her father fixing an engine with steady hands, like her mother explaining fractions to frustrated children. She had inherited that precision. And she was using it to dismantle something much bigger than Samuel Royce. What no one in the building knew was that her arrival had triggered a cascade of protocols. There were people watching remotely, taking notes, time-stamping every word. There were legal motions prepped and waiting, only to be unsealed at the right moment. There were names, accounts, case files, all compiled by her hand, all pointing to one conclusion: the rot didn't stop with Samuel. It started with him, but it reached much higher. As the holding room door closed behind her, the sound of the lock echoed like a warning shot. She sat down slowly on the bench, the cuffs biting into her wrists. Her breathing stayed steady. Her eyes, calm. She looked ahead, focused. Not on escape. But on impact. Because this story, her story, was never about being right. It was about revealing the truth. And the truth was about to burn through the courtroom like wildfire. The question wasn't if justice would be served. The real question was how many people would survive the fallout once it was. The holding cell was colder than it needed to be. Fluorescent lights flickered slightly above, casting a pale, almost sickly glow over the dull cement walls. Keisha sat on the bench, wrists still cuffed behind her, her posture upright, unshaken. Her suit jacket was slightly wrinkled from the handling, but her expression hadn't cracked. Not when they led her through the hallway like she was a criminal, not when Officer Royce leaned in with that smug smirk and hissed beneath his breath that she was just another one who thought she was special, and not even now, with steel bars between her and everyone else. Her heart beat steadily, her breathing was even. This wasn't just control. This was preparation. And the silence of that room wasn't empty, it was ticking. Minutes passed. A metal door creaked open and Royce stepped in alone, his boots heavy on the floor. He didn't speak right away. He leaned against the opposite wall, arms folded, studying her like he couldn't quite figure her out. She knew this was part of his process. He wanted to unravel her. Pull at a thread until she came undone. The way he looked at her wasn't professional. It wasn't even personal. It was territorial. A man who believed this space, this authority, this uniform, gave him the right to dominate the room. And she? She had disrupted his order. He didn't know how. Not yet. But it gnawed at him. He finally broke the silence, voice low and sharp. Said she could have just minded her business. Said she didn't need to stick her nose where it didn't belong. Said he didn't take kindly to being corrected in front of others. She tilted her head slightly, calm as ever, her eyes locked on his. She told him she didn't speak to be liked, she spoke because someone had to. She asked if it made him feel powerful, intimidating a teenager in a courtroom. He didn't answer, only sneered, stepping closer. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and arrogance. He whispered that he'd make sure she learned how things worked around here. That sometimes, a little time behind bars fixed a loud mouth. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, and for a second, it unsettled him. Because he expected fear. Defensiveness. A protest. Not composure. Not this unshakable stillness. She told him, softly, that he should be very careful about how he moved next. That not everything is as it seems. That people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. He didn't understand the full weight of her words. Not yet. But it was beginning to scratch at the edges of his confidence. Back in the courtroom, the hearing continued. The young defendant, Darnell, sat alone, shoulders hunched, glancing occasionally toward the door where Keisha had disappeared. His public defender fumbled through papers, too rushed to care, too overworked to object to how everything had just unfolded. The judge didn't mention Keisha's interruption. No one did. It had already been swept under the procedural rug. Royce's absence barely registered. That was how things worked. One disruption removed, and the system rolled on like a machine swallowing its parts. Downstairs, the second part of the plan was in motion. Agents in plainclothes entered the courthouse one by one, timed to avoid suspicion. One posed as a court reporter, another as a bailiff sub. A third walked through security with a briefcase that held the final key to everything. In another room, a secure line buzzed as an FBI supervisor monitored the entire operation, ready to flip the switch the moment Keisha gave the signal. Royce returned after 15 minutes, told the clerk he had dealt with it, and resumed his place in the courtroom like nothing had happened. He leaned against a wall, arms crossed, confident that whatever that woman thought she was going to do, it had already failed. But there was a tension in his movements now. A small twitch in his jaw. A glance over his shoulder every so often. He didn't trust the silence. He didn't like not knowing. The judge called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, soft but steady. The marble steps gleamed slick under the gray sky. Inside, Keisha was uncuffed, finally, but still confined. The arrest had been unofficial. No charges had been processed. Royce hadn't even logged the incident yet, he didn't want a paper trail until he knew how much trouble she could cause. But that was his first mistake. Because Keisha had already made sure every step he took was recorded. Every word, every gesture, every moment from the courtroom to the cell had been uploaded in real time through the encrypted mic sewn into her lapel. The moment he laid hands on her, the system kicked in. Royce returned to the holding area, this time accompanied by Deputy Maynard, a younger officer with a nervous smile and eyes that moved too quickly. Royce barked an order to process the guest, but when Maynard hesitated, looking at Keisha with a flicker of uncertainty, Royce narrowed his eyes. He pulled him aside, voice hushed but sharp, said she was causing trouble, said she needed to be scared a little. Maynard looked unconvinced. Something about Keisha's calm unnerved him. But years of following orders were hard to shake. He walked back toward the cell with the paperwork half folded in his hand. That was when Keisha stood up. No fear. No rush. She asked if they had a reason for detaining her. Maynard stammered. Said something about interference with an officer. She asked if that was a formal charge. If there was a report. If she was being read her rights. Royce stepped in, snapped that this wasn't a damn interrogation, that she wasn't in charge here. She smiled again. That same small, deliberate smile. Then she looked directly at Maynard and said, "You might want to think very hard about what you put your name on today." That landed. Maynard froze, uncertainty growing. Royce told him to shut it down, to finish the process. Keisha sat again, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. Maynard didn't move. The hallway camera, recently repositioned, was recording all of it. She had ensured that too. Upstairs, Agent Garcia tapped twice on her keyboard, bringing the live feed onto her laptop. Everything was in place. The operation had shifted from surveillance to engagement. But they needed one last confirmation, Keisha's voice, a single phrase coded into the operations protocol. She would say it when she was ready. In the break room, Royce paced slowly. His phone buzzed. A message from a blocked number, "She's not who you think she is." He blinked. Scanned the room. His eyes darted to the security camera. He turned away, palms sweaty now. He dialed dispatch, asked to speak to internal affairs. His voice cracked slightly, a tremor he tried to hide. They told him someone would call back. But the knot in his stomach had already formed. Back in holding, Keisha took a deep breath. She knew the game was almost over. But this moment, the space between accusation and exposure, was the most dangerous part. Royce was unstable when cornered. He might lash out, might act without thinking. That's why she needed to play it perfectly. Her voice had to remain calm, her body still. Every movement calculated. When Royce returned again, he had a different look in his eyes. No longer amused. No longer smug. There was a flicker of recognition, like he knew, deep down, something wasn't right. He stepped into the cell, shut the door behind him, and lowered his voice. "You've got one chance to tell me who the hell you really are." Keisha looked up, her tone steady, every syllable sharp. "I think it's time you start worrying about who you really are." He laughed, but it was hollow, forced. She continued, softer now. "Because I promise you, after today, that badge won't protect you." Outside, agents were in position. Upstairs, the courtroom filled again for the next hearing. Garcia's voice buzzed through the earpiece of the lead agent on site. "We're green. Waiting on her call." And inside that cold, dim cell, Keisha leaned forward slightly, locked eyes with the man who had believed he held all the power, and said 6 words that changed the entire game. "Your arrogance just signed your warrant." Then she sat back. And everything began to unravel. What happened next would shake the walls of the courthouse, flip the narrative, and leave every witness questioning what they thought they knew about justice. But you'll have to wait to see it unfold. Because what's coming is bigger than anyone ever imagined. There was a moment, just a breath, when time seemed to hesitate inside that dimly lit holding cell. Royce stood completely still, his eyes narrowing as Keisha's words echoed in the air like smoke from a lit match. She didn't blink. Her voice had dropped into a tone so calm it bordered on chilling, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. His fingers hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but on instinct. Control was slipping. He felt it. Something in her posture had shifted, in her expression, in the way she seemed to be holding the entire room in the palm of her hand, despite the steel bars and concrete walls. She didn't look like someone waiting to be released, she looked like someone waiting for confirmation. That small detail sat heavy in his gut. He knew that look. It wasn't fear. It was the same look he had seen on federal agents standing behind mirrored glass, waiting to pounce. And he hated it. Keisha leaned back, and for the first time, let herself exhale fully. This was the moment she had rehearsed over and over, every sentence, every angle, every possible escalation. She had been trained for high-stakes confrontations, but nothing compared to facing someone who believed they were untouchable. She scanned his face, catching the flickers of confusion trying to disguise themselves as anger. She decided to speak, but not loud, just enough to make sure he heard every syllable with perfect clarity. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said, not as a question, but as a quiet fact. Royce's eyebrows twitched, a faint crack in his mask. He laughed softly, shaking his head, pretending to shrug it off. "Lady, I don't even know what this little performance is about, but I promise you, it ends with you walking out of here embarrassed." She kept her eyes on him. "It ends with you walking out of here in cuffs." The laugh cut short. He stared. His mind raced, tripping over itself, trying to place her. He scanned her features again, digging through memory. But there was no past connection. He hadn't seen her before this week. He was sure. So how the hell did she speak like that? With certainty. With authority. He took a step forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper, words sharp. "You're bluffing. This is nothing. You interrupted court and got what was coming. You think you're gonna scare me with a couple of big words? She tilted her head. I think facts scare you more than words. He squinted, suddenly unsettled by her stillness. Who are you? And that was when the door behind him clicked open, slowly and without rush. Royce turned sharply, expecting Maynard or a court officer, but it wasn't either. It was a woman in plain clothes, her badge displayed openly on her belt. Behind her were two more agents, both armed and composed. The lead agent stepped into the room like she had done it 1,000 times. Her voice was clear, formal, controlled. Samuel Royce, you are under investigation for obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, falsifying police records, and conspiracy to suppress civil rights under color of law. You are to be taken into federal custody immediately. Royce didn't move. He turned toward Keisha again, eyes wide. For a moment, he looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff without realizing it until it was too late. She stood, slowly, and adjusted her jacket. The cuffs were gone, Maynard had removed them minutes earlier, and the agents had made sure everything since had been recorded. She walked toward him, every step deliberate, every inch closing the gap of power that he had held over her for those brief, humiliating minutes. I'm Special Agent Keisha Monroe, she said, her voice low but firm. And I've been investigating you for 8 months. His lips parted slightly. No sound came out. I embedded into this courthouse because you were protected by people who believed your paperwork mattered more than your victims. I watched you bury cases. I watched you manipulate reports. I watched you intimidate witnesses and walk away clean. He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't let him. Her voice sharpened. You used your badge like a weapon. You hid behind protocols, behind silence. You thought this system would protect you forever. One of the agents stepped forward with the handcuffs. Royce backed away instinctively. This is a setup, he barked, finally finding his voice again, loud and desperate. She provoked me. This is entrapment. She planned it. Keisha cut him off. You're right. I did plan it. The room went still. I knew you would react exactly the way you always do when a black woman challenges your authority. I didn't have to fake anything. I just had to let you be yourself, with the world watching this time. Royce's breathing grew heavy. His hands twitched, but he wasn't resisting, he was unraveling. His eyes darted between the agents, the doorway, Keisha. Nothing made sense anymore. The courtroom upstairs, the judge who didn't stop the arrest, the guard who looked the other way, all of it was coming into focus. It wasn't just a trap. It was a takedown. The agent behind him stepped forward again, finally snapping the cuffs around his wrists. Royce turned his head to Keisha one last time, face red, veins tight on his neck. You think this changes anything? You think putting me in cuffs erases anything? She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through concrete. No. But it makes it stop. He was led out of the room, down the hallway he once walked with pride, now with every eye watching, every step echoing judgment. Keisha followed behind, silent. No gloating. No smile. Just steady breath, one foot in front of the other. Upstairs, the courtroom had resumed. Darnell was still there, sitting quietly, still in orange. When the door opened and Royce was brought in, flanked by agents, the judge halted mid-sentence. The silence was electric. No one moved. No one spoke. Royce was walked past the benches, past the same people who had watched him exert unchecked authority for years. His badge was gone. His hands were bound. The air itself had shifted. Keisha stepped into the room, flanked by Agent Garcia and another federal official. She didn't walk with bravado. She didn't need to. The moment was loud enough. She stopped near the front and handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. The judge, confused, opened it slowly. Inside were transcripts. Surveillance footage logs. A federal court order. And something else, an arrest warrant. For a second, the judge's hands trembled. The room remained silent. Keisha turned to the courtroom. Her eyes moved from face to face, not accusing, not shaming, just witnessing. She saw the silent acknowledgement in some, the confusion in others, the realization in many. Change didn't come from outrage. It came from exposure. And right now, the system was exposed. The judge cleared his throat, voice suddenly uncertain. "Would you care to explain this, Agent Monroe?" Keisha nodded once, and spoke into the silence. This courtroom was used to protect predators disguised as protectors. Today, that ends. Every person in that room now understood they weren't just watching justice unfold. They were watching it arrive. And what Keisha said next, the very last thing before the agents escorted Royce out of the building, would be etched into every memory for years to come. But to hear that, you'll have to wait just one more moment. Because what she revealed after, was even more personal than anyone could have guessed. As Royce was escorted out of the courtroom, his boots dragging slightly against the polished floor, the silence behind him wasn't just from shock, it was heavy with realization. It was the sound of people recalibrating what they thought they knew about the man who had walked those halls for over a decade like he owned every square inch. People didn't speak because they didn't know how. Some stared down at their laps, others kept their eyes fixed on Keisha as if trying to reframe every memory they had of that morning. She stood still near the bench, her posture upright, her hands calmly clasped in front of her. The judge had yet to say another word. The bailiff stood with the envelope still open, and even the court clerk had stopped typing. The weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air like thick fog, and Keisha knew the moment that followed would define everything. She hadn't just exposed one man. She'd shattered the illusion of untouchability. And now, it was time to make it personal. She turned to the judge. Her voice didn't waver. "Your Honor, before I leave this courtroom, there's something you need to hear, something the public needs to hear." The judge hesitated, then nodded slowly. His tone softened, cautious now. "Go ahead, Agent Monroe." Keisha stepped forward, not to the podium, but to the center of the room. She didn't need notes. Her memory was razor sharp. Her heart, steady. Her words were slow, deliberate, the kind that aren't rehearsed but lived. "For the past 8 months, I've been operating undercover through a federal task force aimed at identifying patterns of systemic abuse within state-level law enforcement agencies. This courthouse was identified as a red zone. Not because of public complaints, but because of what didn't show up, cases quietly dropped, evidence that disappeared, arrests made without probable cause and swept away before anyone could raise a flag." She paused, letting that settle. Then she turned slightly toward the gallery. "I witnessed dozens of moments where justice was not denied in loud, violent acts, but in small, quiet ones. In silence. In people who looked away. In protocols used as shields. And the man you saw walk out in cuffs just now wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a larger disease. He knew how to play the system because the system taught him how to play it." The judge straightened in his seat, clearly uneasy, but he didn't interrupt. "And I let myself be arrested here today because I needed to show you, not just tell you, how easily power is abused when no one is watching. How quickly the law becomes a weapon instead of a shield when it's in the wrong hands." There was a pause. One of those silences that stretched, not out of discomfort, but out of attention. People were listening. Then her voice shifted, just slightly, warmer, more personal. 5 years ago, my younger brother was stopped 2 blocks from his apartment building in Savannah. He had no weapons, no warrants. He fit a description. He told the officer he had done nothing wrong. He was polite. He followed directions. He still ended up with a broken wrist and 3 charges he had to fight for over a year. She glanced toward the benches where a few public defenders now sat with their heads slightly bowed. "I went into law enforcement because of him. Because I wanted to believe that justice wasn't just a theory. And every time I see another young man like my brother in a courtroom like this one, treated like a threat before they even speak, I'm reminded why I'm still here. She looked toward Darnell now, the young defendant who had watched her be taken away in cuffs only hours earlier. His eyes were locked on her, wide and filled with something he hadn't felt all morning, hope. And when I saw that boy being handled like a criminal for defending himself against nothing but suspicion, I knew it was time. The judge cleared his throat again. His voice was strained. Agent Monroe, is there more you intend to share on the record? Keisha nodded, slowly. I do. Then she pulled from her inner jacket pocket a small flash drive, held it up, and handed it to the bailiff. On this drive is a full record of every manipulated report, every body cam conveniently shut off, every testimony coerced or rewritten under Officer Royce's hand. And it doesn't stop there. It includes the names of officers who knew, who protected him, and those who stayed silent. Not because they didn't know, but because silence was easier than accountability. The courtroom gasped, a sound that felt like it had been held in for years. The judge's hands shook slightly as he took the flash drive. He looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Why now? He asked, not aggressively, almost softly. Why expose everything like this? Keisha's voice was even. Because people like Royce don't believe in consequences unless they're shown. And people watching from the outside don't believe justice is possible unless they see it. She let those words breathe. Then she turned toward the exit. But just before she stepped away, a voice stopped her. It was Darnell. He stood up, slowly, nervously. His voice cracked. Ma'am, does this mean I'm free? Keisha looked back, a small but unmistakable smile at the corners of her mouth. You were never the one who should have been on trial. The courtroom murmured as Darnell sat down again, eyes wide, lips pressed together to hold in the emotion threatening to spill out. As Keisha walked down the corridor, agents following behind her, her steps were quiet but firm. Outside, a group of onlookers had gathered. Word had spread fast. Reporters were setting up cameras. Local activists stood silently, holding phones, some holding each other's hands. She passed them without a word, but her presence said enough. And somewhere inside that building, as the data on that flash drive began to crack the walls of what had always been seen as untouchable, a ripple had begun. Inside the transport vehicle, Royce sat with his head against the window. His cuffs rattled slightly with the movement of the van. Across from him sat Agent Daniels, one of the lead investigators. Royce looked up suddenly, voice low, hoarse. She set me up. Daniels stared at him a moment before replying. She didn't set you up. She just stopped you from hiding. Royce looked away, his jaw tight. The badge that once gave him power was now just a memory. And back inside the bureau office, Keisha sat across from her supervisor, who poured her a coffee without asking, placing it gently in front of her. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was reverent. You good? The supervisor asked. Keisha nodded, eyes tired but clear. Yeah. I'm good. Anything you would have done differently? She thought for a moment, then shook her head. No. It had to be seen to be believed. The supervisor leaned back, smiling softly. Well, they saw it. And though the weight of what she'd just done hadn't fully landed yet, Keisha knew one thing for sure, something had shifted. Not everything, not overnight. But something real. Something irreversible. And what she didn't know yet, what no one did, was that this moment was just the beginning. Because the system she cracked open, was deeper than any of them had guessed. The days following the courtroom takedown did not unfold with fireworks or dramatic headlines echoing instant change. Instead, there was a quiet, pulsing tension in the city of Augusta that buzzed just beneath the surface, in offices, community centers, and living rooms. People were talking, some whispering, some shouting. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Keisha Monroe walked a razor-thin line between vindication and reflection. Her actions had sparked a reckoning, yes, but they had also stirred something deeper, something heavier. Change, as she knew well, didn't come without casualties. And the echoes of what had just happened were only beginning to reach the corners that mattered. Within 48 hours, the footage had gone viral. News networks picked up the moment Agent Monroe revealed herself, clipped it, spun it, dissected it. One version painted her as a hero who dared to go undercover in a corrupt system. Another criticized her for endangering herself and tricking the court. There were debates about ethics, legality, and whether the federal government had overstepped. None of that mattered to Keisha. The mission had been accomplished. But the aftermath was a different kind of battlefield, one where the lines weren't so clearly drawn. Where allies revealed themselves in surprising places, and enemies cloaked themselves in policy, procedure, and polite professionalism. The flash drive she submitted had cracked open not just one man's file, but a network of misconduct that extended across departments, into prosecutors' offices, and even touched private correctional partnerships. Internal audits were launched. Several officers resigned, suddenly, to avoid internal review. One of the judges listed in her report took a leave of absence pending investigation. Some of the public defenders, quietly and without notice, began taking long vacations. It was a ripple effect, and every day brought a new consequence. Yet, for every document exposed, Keisha felt the weight of the names behind them, the people who hadn't been believed, the lives disrupted, the years lost. She sat in her temporary apartment, a federal safe house disguised as an old two-story rental tucked into a quiet neighborhood. A single lamp lit the room, and a stack of documents lay beside her untouched. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, reporters, agents, local officials. She answered almost none of them. That night, she just needed silence. She stared at the screensaver on her laptop, a picture of her younger brother holding their niece at a family barbecue. She hadn't seen him since before the operation began. Not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't, not while pretending to be someone else, not while living with secrets under her skin. He didn't know what she'd done yet. He would find out soon enough, and she wasn't sure what he would feel. Pride? Anger? Both? There was a knock at the door. 3 slow taps, followed by 2 quick ones, a protocol knock. She stood, stepped to the peephole, and opened the door. Agent Garcia stepped in, her coat damp from the rain. "I figured you wouldn't be sleeping," she said quietly. Keisha didn't answer. Garcia walked in, glanced at the untouched dinner on the table, then sat down across from her. "You made national news," she said after a beat. "I didn't want news. I wanted reform," Keisha replied, voice low. Garcia nodded. "Sometimes they come together. Sometimes one swallows the other." There was a long pause. Then Garcia reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. She slid it across the table. "Thought you should see this before it goes up the chain. Community response data. Letters, emails, a few editorials." Keisha opened the folder slowly. Inside were screenshots of social media posts from parents, testimonials from young men who had gone silent for years, a handwritten note from a retired officer thanking her for having the courage he never did. There were also editorials calling her reckless, questioning her tactics. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a petition with over 30,000 signatures demanding a full investigation into the department. She closed the folder, her fingers lingering on the edge. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. "This is the start of something harder." Garcia leaned back in her chair. "Are you ready for that?" Keisha looked out the rain-speckled window for a moment before answering. "I don't know. But I know I can't unsee what I've seen. And I can't unfeel what it means to be believed after so many years of watching others dismissed." There was another pause, then Garcia added, "There's a hearing next week. Federal Review Board. They want your recommendation on how to proceed. Structural reform, oversight, criminal prosecution, you'll have a say." Keisha didn't respond right away. She knew the power of that offer. But she also knew the trap of tokenism, of being paraded around as a symbol while the roots of injustice grew deeper underground. She had made a dent. Now she had to make sure it didn't close itself back up. A few days later, she returned to the courthouse, not as a spy, not as a suspect, but as a witness. Darnell's case had been reopened under new review, and she insisted on being present. The courtroom looked different now. Not in design, but in energy. People whispered her name. Some avoided her eyes. Others nodded discreetly. She sat in the back row, unassuming as always. The judge presiding this time was a visiting federal circuit judge, brought in to avoid local bias. The prosecution's tone was suddenly restrained, almost nervous. And the moment Darnell was called forward, Keisha watched him with quiet pride. He stood straighter now. Not cocky, just a little taller. When the judge asked if he understood the terms of his dismissal, he nodded, eyes wet but determined. No anger. No gloating. Just breath. Relief. Outside the courthouse, a reporter caught up to Keisha. Agent Monroe, do you believe justice has been served? She stopped, looked at the young woman holding the mic, then past her, at the courthouse, at the people exiting behind her. Justice isn't a moment, she said. It's a process. And we've just taken one step. The reporter asked another question, but Keisha was already walking away. That night, her brother finally called. The line was quiet for a few seconds before he spoke. So, that was you? She smiled faintly. Yeah. He exhaled. You're insane. I know. But I'm proud of you. I know that too. There was a silence then. A shared understanding. You coming home soon? Soon. She hung up, a sense of stillness settling into her chest. Not peace, not yet. But stillness. Because the next step wasn't about shock. It was about persistence. About using this moment not to shine, but to change something. And she knew exactly where to begin. The following week moved with a quiet intensity, like the calm that follows a storm, not because the danger was gone, but because everyone was holding their breath to see what would come next. Keisha returned to her bureau office in Atlanta under a different light now, no longer hidden in operation but fully visible, her name circulating through emails and meeting rooms, her face showing up in internal reports and security briefings. The bureau was split. Some praised her boldness, some whispered about the optics, others questioned the risks she took. But none of them could deny the outcome. And it was in that complicated silence that Keisha felt something shift inside her, not confidence exactly, but clarity. She understood now that the hardest work came after the moment of impact. That the cleanup, the reconstruction, the accountability, that was where real change lived. And she wasn't walking away from it. She stood before a panel of senior agents in a secure conference room with thick glass walls and neutral tones that muted every emotion. At the center of the table sat Director Mills, an older man with a reputation for being sharp but fair, flanked by two women and another man who represented various departments, legal, ethics, operations. They asked questions in calm tones, but the weight of them was clear. They weren't just assessing the mission's success. They were gauging the Bureau's liability, its public image, its long-term risk. Keisha answered with precision, not defiance. She explained the planning, the surveillance, the collaboration with local community liaisons, the legal clearance obtained in advance. She reminded them that the operation was approved under internal authority and that the targets had been identified based on verifiable patterns. But then, when the room grew quiet and the questions slowed, Director Mills leaned forward and asked her something different, something no one else had dared to ask. Agent Monroe, did any part of this feel personal? There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. Keisha paused. She could have said no. She could have followed the script. But she didn't. Yes, she said quietly, looking him in the eyes. Of course it did. It had to. Mills didn't interrupt. I'm a black woman who grew up seeing men like Samuel Royce get away with what they did. I've seen boys like my brother silenced, cases buried, victims shamed. I couldn't do this work effectively if I didn't feel it in my bones. But I never let it cloud my judgment. I let it sharpen my focus. Another pause, longer this time. Then Mills nodded. Good. Just be careful not to lose the difference. She left the meeting not with a medal, not with applause, but with something more valuable, freedom to keep going. Later that afternoon, she found herself in a neighborhood park on the south side of Atlanta, a quiet spot with benches worn by time and trees that whispered like elders. Darnell was there, seated on the edge of a table near the basketball court, his hoodie pulled halfway up, his posture guarded but open. He'd reached out through his caseworker, said he wanted to see her. No cameras. No news stories. Just a conversation. Keisha approached slowly, giving him time to acknowledge her. He looked up, offered a slight nod. She sat beside him without a word, letting the silence settle around them before speaking. How's school? She asked. He shrugged, then offered a small smirk. Better now that I don't gotta wear orange to it. She smiled faintly. I imagine that helps. He shifted, picking at the corner of the wooden table. Everyone keeps asking me how it felt, seeing you take him down like that. Keisha waited, letting him work through the thought. And? He looked at her, eyes searching. I don't know what to say. Like, part of me feels like I should feel powerful. Like something was made right. But the other part of me. I'm just tired. That honesty cut through her chest. She nodded slowly. Justice isn't always satisfying, she said. It's not clean. Sometimes it just feels like survival with a better ending. He was quiet for a long time before speaking again. Were you scared? Keisha turned toward him. Yes. But not of him. He furrowed his brow slightly, confused. I was scared that nothing would change. That I'd go through all of it, and people would still look the other way. Darnell nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I think that's what scares me too. That next time, it's someone else. Or me again. She didn't offer false promises. She didn't tell him it wouldn't happen. She simply said, you don't have to carry that alone anymore. They sat for a while, watching the wind move through the trees. When he eventually stood and walked off toward the nearby bus stop, Keisha stayed behind, letting herself breathe into the quiet. That night, she met with Maynard. The young deputy officer had formally resigned earlier that week, citing ethical conflict as the reason. But when he called Keisha, asking for 5 minutes to talk, she agreed. They met at a diner on the edge of town, one of those old places with cracked booths and faded menus, where the waitresses knew your name and coffee came before you asked. Maynard looked tired. Not broken, just unsettled. He sat across from her, hands clasped, fidgeting with a sugar packet. I should have said something, he began. Keisha let him speak. I saw how he looked at you. I knew it wasn't right. But I'd been quiet for so long, it felt easier. She nodded, waiting. When you looked at me in that cell and said, think hard about what you put your name on, that was the first time I realized I could say no. Keisha stirred her coffee, then looked up. You did more than most. You listened. That matters. He looked down. I'm not proud. You don't have to be proud yet. You just have to be better tomorrow. He looked at her then, something loosening in his expression. What happens now? Keisha leaned back, her gaze distant. Now. We hold the next ones accountable. We protect the ones still being ignored. We rebuild. The conversation lingered in the air long after the check was paid. In the following weeks, Keisha found herself pulled into advisory meetings, working with civil rights attorneys and policy advocates. She helped draft new guidelines for undercover federal investigations involving local enforcement. She reviewed past complaints flagged during her initial investigation and met with families who had almost lost hope. Each interaction carried its own emotional weight, its own burden of truth. And each time, she carried it with the same care she brought into that courtroom. But one meeting left a mark she didn't expect. A mother. 60 years old. Her son had been arrested 6 years ago by Royce for a minor infraction that escalated into felony charges based on falsified evidence. He was still serving time. She sat across from Keisha at a community center, her hands trembling as she passed over the original police report. "My baby didn't even fight back," she said. "They said he reached for a weapon. But he was left-handed. And it was in his right pocket." Keisha read the report, felt her throat tighten. "We'll reopen this," she said. "I promise." The woman nodded, eyes wet but grateful. "No one's ever said that to me before." Keisha swallowed hard, holding her gaze. "You're hearing it now." As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the pavement outside, Keisha stood in the parking lot alone. She closed her eyes and let the warmth hit her face. The fire had started with Royce. But the embers had spread. And Keisha wasn't done. Not yet. 3 weeks passed, and the air around Augusta no longer felt still, it buzzed with cautious energy. Change had begun to take root, not just in the upper offices and press releases but in the small, often overlooked corners of the city. The local coffee shop had taken down its framed photo of Royce that once hung near the register. A defense attorney who had previously turned a blind eye was now hosting free legal aid clinics on weekends. A school counselor at the local high school started checking in with her black students more often, no longer assuming silence meant safety. These weren't headlines. They were seeds. And Keisha saw them sprouting one by one, each with a cost, each with a purpose. Keisha's days became longer. She was no longer shadowed by secrecy but by responsibility. Every email she opened carried the weight of someone's story. People who had once stayed silent were now speaking. Some whispered their truths, trembling through every sentence. Others sent detailed timelines, documents, names. Survivors, officers, parents, clerks, all surfacing from beneath years of systemic denial. The task force she helped create had grown rapidly. Cases reopened. New investigations launched. Still, even amid the forward momentum, Keisha felt the weight of what had been lost along the way. Some victims would never see a courtroom. Some families would never get a formal apology. And some lives had been altered so deeply that no justice, no matter how swift, could restore what was taken. One afternoon, she sat across from a man named Terrence Hall, a former corrections officer turned whistleblower. He was in his early 50s, with deep-set eyes and calloused hands that trembled slightly as he poured sugar into his tea. They were in a small diner on the outskirts of Augusta, the kind where time seemed to move slower, and people spoke with care. He looked at Keisha like someone who had carried a story for too long, unsure if it was still safe to speak it. "I saw him," Terrence said, voice low. "Royce. 3 years ago. He came through booking with a boy named Anthony Davis. 18. Quiet kid. Said he tried to run, but something about the whole thing felt off. No resisting charges, but his face was bruised when he got there." Keisha listened closely, nodding slowly. "I filed a report," he continued. "Did what we were supposed to. But it disappeared. Like it was never written. I was told not to push it. I did. Got moved to night shift, then desk duty. Eventually, I quit." Keisha kept her tone even. "Why now?" Terrence looked down at his tea, then back at her. "Because I saw what you did. You made it feel possible to come forward. That hasn't happened here before." She leaned forward. "Do you have names? Dates? Copies of anything?" He reached into his coat and pulled out an old spiral notebook, yellowed with age but meticulously kept. Names, dates, notes scribbled in careful lines. It was more than evidence, it was testimony. "I need this to matter," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Not for me. For the ones who didn't get back up." Keisha took the notebook gently, nodding once. "It will." That night, she found herself walking the familiar halls of the regional office, the building dim and quiet. Her office light flickered as she stepped inside. She sat at her desk and opened the notebook, slowly scanning the pages. Anthony Davis. Calvin Brooks. Marcus Edens. Names that hadn't made it into any report. Stories swallowed by silence. She typed slowly, inputting every detail into the task force database. As she worked, her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Garcia: "We need to talk. Something's come up." They met in the Bureau's Situation Room, a sterile space filled with screens, maps, and files. Garcia closed the door behind her and handed Keisha a thick manila envelope. "We just pulled surveillance footage from a courthouse auxiliary camera," she said, her voice tight. "It was supposed to be out of order the day you were arrested. But we recovered the data from the cloud." Keisha opened the envelope and pulled out a series of printed stills. They showed Royce not just arresting her, but moments before, speaking with someone outside the courthouse, a man in a dark suit. The timestamp placed the interaction 15 minutes before she stood up in court. "That man," Garcia said, pointing, "is Assistant DA Vincent Kerr." Keisha felt something cold slide into her spine. Kerr had been known for being tough on crime, a rising star in the prosecutor's office with a reputation for high conviction rates and ironclad deals. She had suspected him of enabling Royce, but there had never been evidence. Until now. "You think he was tipping Royce off?" Keisha asked. "Worse," Garcia said. "We think he was feeding Royce targets. Young defendants. Ones without strong representation. He'd push the cases through, Royce would make the arrests stick." Keisha closed her eyes for a brief second, fury rising and settling like a wave. "Build the case," she said. Discreetly. "If this is real, it goes deeper than we thought." In the days that followed, the scope of the investigation widened. Financial records were traced, communications unearthed, plea deals reviewed. What began as a single takedown was now unraveling a conspiracy that had shaped lives for years. A pattern emerged: black and brown defendants targeted with disproportionate charges, coerced into plea deals under the threat of Royce's testimony. Court-appointed attorneys pressured into silence. Families financially ruined, children funneled into a cycle they never chose. The weight of it was staggering. Keisha found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in her mind. Was there more she could have done? Had she waited too long? For every case she cracked open, there were 5 more behind it, voices begging to be heard. One evening, her brother called again. His voice was softer this time, tinged with concern. "You holding up?" he asked. She exhaled. "Some days better than others." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You always were the one who kept going, no matter what. But don't forget, you can't fix everything. You're not alone." Those words stayed with her, echoed in her chest the next morning as she met with the task force team, now expanded to include legal aid reps, community advocates, and even a few former officers who had come forward. Together, they mapped out a strategy not just for prosecution, but for healing. Restorative justice sessions. Civil settlements. Community forums to let people speak, out loud, with witnesses. And at one of those forums, something happened that Keisha didn't expect. A woman stood at the back of the gymnasium, wearing a faded blue blouse and holding a folder against her chest. She waited until everyone had spoken, then stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. "I was one of the court clerks who processed Royce's reports. I never said anything. I should have. I let things slide because I didn't want to lose my job. I told myself I was just doing paperwork. But I saw the names. I saw the patterns. And I didn't say a word. The room went quiet. Keisha met the woman's eyes. She didn't judge her. She didn't speak. I just needed to say it, the woman whispered. Out loud. That moment, simple, raw, unadorned, struck deeper than any legal argument. It was a reminder that justice didn't just come from exposure. It came from acknowledgement. From people who chose truth over comfort. Even when it hurt. As the forum ended, Keisha stepped outside into the cool evening air. She watched families gather, young men laugh, neighbors talk. And she realized that while the courtroom had been the flashpoint, these conversations, these confessions, were the revolution. It wasn't over. But something irreversible had begun. 6 months after the courtroom shattered its silence and power shifted for the first time in years, the city of Augusta stood on new ground. It hadn't been rebuilt, not entirely, wounds like those don't vanish overnight, but the foundation had cracked open enough to let truth in, and that was more than anyone thought possible when this all began. The federal investigations led to over a dozen arrests, including Assistant DA Vincent Kerr, who was indicted on multiple counts of prosecutorial misconduct, conspiracy, and perjury. The man who once walked courthouse halls with polished shoes and smug confidence now entered a courtroom in cuffs, escorted by the very justice system he had long manipulated. His fall was public and humiliating, and though many argued he deserved more than prison time, the image of his silence as victims gave testimony in court became its own kind of retribution. Royce, meanwhile, faced a separate federal trial, and his conviction was swift. With testimonies from more than 40 individuals, ranging from former defendants to ex-colleagues, prison staff, and internal bureau agents, the case built against him was unshakable. He was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole, with additional civil suits lined up behind his conviction. There were no supporters outside the courthouse on the day of his sentencing. No one to cheer or plead for leniency. Just silence, cameras, and a community no longer afraid of speaking. He left the building not as a feared officer, but as a disgraced symbol of unchecked power, and this time, no badge would cover it. Darnell, the young man whose case lit the fuse, received not only a full dismissal of all charges, but a scholarship fund created in his name through a new initiative championed by Keisha and several legal organizations. He enrolled in a criminal justice program the following semester. When asked why, he answered simply that someone needed to be on the inside who remembered what it felt like to be silenced. His story was no longer that of a victim, it became a point of hope, a reminder that the ones underestimated most often hold the keys to change. As for Deputy Maynard, his resignation became the catalyst for something more meaningful. After months of quiet work with Keisha and community organizations, he launched a nonprofit dedicated to retraining former law enforcement officers and guiding them toward roles in restorative justice programs. His name slowly transformed from a symbol of compliance to one of redemption. He didn't pretend to be a hero, he acknowledged his failure and chose to build something from it. And in that choice, he earned a new kind of respect. But it was Keisha who stood at the center of this story's final chapter. In the months following the investigation, she was offered multiple promotions, media appearances, even a book deal. She declined all of them. Not because she didn't value her work, but because the moment was never about recognition, it was about restoration. Instead, she accepted a position leading a newly formed federal unit focused on dismantling racially biased patterns in local judicial systems. A team of lawyers, psychologists, sociologists, and community leaders worked under her guidance, developing tools to audit courtrooms across the country. She didn't chase the spotlight, but the spotlight found her anyway, because the kind of leadership she embodied couldn't be hidden. On the one-year anniversary of the trial, she returned to the same courtroom where it all began. The air felt different now. Brighter. The old judge had retired, and a new one, an Afro-Latina woman with a history of grassroots advocacy, now presided. The staff was new. The energy in the room held none of the fear it once did. Keisha didn't come for ceremony. She came for a meeting. But as she walked through the courtroom aisle, people noticed. Some stood. A few offered soft nods. She smiled, acknowledging their presence, then took a seat near the back and let herself breathe in the stillness. Later that day, she visited her childhood home in Savannah. Her brother greeted her with open arms and a quiet that didn't need words. They sat on the porch swing their father once fixed, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. After a long pause, he spoke, voice gentle. "You did something real, Kuish." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "So did you. You waited for me to come back." He smiled. "You always come back." And in that moment, she felt a peace that had eluded her through the sleepless nights, the press briefings, the files spread across her desk like a battlefield. She had not just exposed injustice, she had shifted a culture, inspired a generation to stop whispering and start holding power accountable. And most of all, she reminded the world that black women are not here to be silenced. They are here to lead, to heal, to rebuild what has been broken. But now I turn to you. Because this story, Keisha's story, Darnell's, Terrence's, Maynard's, isn't just about them. It's about all of us. About the choices we make when no one is watching. About the moments we feel like stepping back, and instead, decide to step forward. It's about recognizing when silence is no longer safety, but complicity. And asking yourself, what would you have done in that courtroom? Would you have looked away? Or would you have stood up? If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep, anger, pride, sadness, hope, then let it sit with you. Let it push you. Let it call you into spaces where truth matters more than comfort. And now, I want to hear from you. What part of this story hit you the hardest? What would you have done if you were in Keisha's shoes? Or Darnell's? Tell me in the comments. I want to read your thoughts, your reflections, your truth. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you want more tales that twist not just plots, but perspectives, then don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. Your voice matters here. Your story matters. And we're just getting started.